Hello BookTube, Books with Banks back again with another video. Today I'm going to be basically ranking my experiences with Shakespeare. So this will be in total a set of 4 different ranking lists. First I'm going to rank the 4, kind of 5, but I'll explain that. Shakespeare plays that I've actually seen performed, how much I like those performances. Then, like on a stage in an actual theater. Then I'm going to rank the roughly 5 films I consider to be like Shakespeare kind of redone or reworked in a different type of adaptation. So you're not getting like exactly his original dialogue or anything. That certain elements of the story might be changed around. And these are just the movies that I clearly recognize are based on Shakespeare in some way, shape, or form. But I'm sure there might be a ton more because I haven't read everything. I haven't watched everything that's been all of his plays have been adapted into, and so I might not be able to catch what is actually a modern retelling or something like that. But yeah, so first list is the plays I've seen in person, I've gone to the theater to see. The second list are movies that are kind of these modern retellings or different type of retellings. And then the third list is going to be all of the movies I've seen that are basically just the play but on screen. Now some of those might be a little bit more modern, or the setting or certain elements of it might be a little different than how it was originally performed, but as long as the dialogue is what Shakespeare wrote, as long as it for the most part adheres to the actual text of the play, I'm going to include any of those film adaptations in this third list. And then last but not least, I'll rank all of the, I believe right now it's at 14, all of the 14 Shakespeare plays that I've actually gone through and read. And of course then there's going to be some overlap between what I've read and what I've seen in any way, shape, or form. So here we go. List 1. These are plays or productions that I've gone to the theater to see. In 4th place, I'm going to have to go with The Merry Wives of Windsor. I saw this in a Shakespeare in the Park kind of setting, and our seating was not very good, or like, where we set up our blankets and stuff. And our chairs, we didn't have a good view of the stage. It was pretty loud, and some of his comedies, in particular this one, can get a little bit chaotic with some of the slapstick, and so it was just a little hard to follow. I'm curious to maybe read the play one day because it does have one of my favorite characters, being Falstaff, but I didn't know about him at the time that I saw this, and I didn't know much about Shakespeare at the time I saw this, so unfortunately I think just because of the conditions that I saw it in, I'm going to have to put Merry Wives of Windsor, one of his comedies, in 4th place. And then in 3rd place, I'll put Taming of the Shrew. This was one of like the 2nd or 3rd maybe plays I ever actually went to a theater to see performed like live on a stage. I'd seen like Arsenic and Old Lace and maybe Brigadoon. So this was the first Shakespeare I ever really had experience with. I thought it was hilarious. I was a little too young to get a lot of the humor and to keep up with a lot of the dialogue, but the way that they presented it, I mean, I remember following the story at least very clearly, very well, and I really enjoyed that. It is goofy. After all, it's Taming of the Shrew. It's a comedy, and it's a little, maybe not even just a little sexist. It's pretty sexist. But yeah, so that comes in the 3rd. Not a horrible thing, and kind of has a nostalgic special place in my memory. And then here I'll kind of do a 2.5. You're between 3rd place and 2nd place. I'll talk about Kiss Me Kate. So I saw one production when I was in middle school of Kiss Me Kate. For those of you who don't know, this is like a play that is a modern, or it's a play about a theater troupe putting on Taming of the Shrew. So a couple layers there, a little bit meta, and I think it's funny, it's cute. The songs are, sorry, yeah, it is a musical, and the music is pretty entertaining. And then when I was in high school, it's actually probably one of my least favorite musicals that we wound up doing, but we did do this musical. my senior year in high school, and I was like on the props crew and running crew behind the scenes during all of the production nights or the show nights, and so that was a ton of fun. And so I have to mention Kiss Me Kate. It holds a special place in my heart. Then in second place, I'll talk about Othello. I saw this, it was a college performance when I was in my undergrad, and I thought it was really good. I knew a lot about the narrative beats of Othello. This is the only time this play, this work of Shakespeare's, one of his more famous probably, is going to appear in any of these rankings. I've not read it or seen any other adaptation of it, but I thought it was fine. I thought it was really, really good. Tragic, great characters, decent production by a group of college students. Yeah, Othello comes in second place. And then in first, this is the only one of these that I've seen a couple times. I've seen Hamlet twice, and it's just difficult not to give Hamlet the credit that it's due. It's such a wonderful show, and it's so interesting. I mean, just the character of Hamlet himself, he's so fascinating and unlikable, but you just can't look away whenever he's on stage, especially if you have a good performer portraying him. So yeah, Hamlet comes in at first in my ranking of the 4 Shakespeare plays I've actually seen in the theater. Next up, we've got the ones that are sort of like retellings, not strictly the play that it's based on, these movies that are these retellings. And this is a list of 5 films. So in 5th place, I'll put She's the Man. I think She's the Man was really trying to do for Twelfth Night, one of his comedies, what 10 Things I Hate About You did very well for Taming of the Shrew, like a few years before. And I think She's the Man, some of the humor was just a little more immature. It just didn't, it doesn't hold up well in my memory very much, and I'd rather go out, get Twelfth Night and read through that again before watching She's the Man again, if that makes sense. So yeah, She's the Man's gonna go in 5th place. It's funny, but it's just, it doesn't really stack up against some of the other ones in this category. And then in 4th place, I'll say The Lion King, which is, it's obviously classic. Everybody loves The Lion King. Not many lists would you find it ranked 4th and for any reason. But here, I think it is pretty widely accepted that this is kind of a loose adaptation of Hamlet. And I think I rank it so low because I don't think it's a very good adaptation of Hamlet. I think it's a great movie, but because it's a Disney film for kids, they cut out a lot of the tragic elements that really appeal to me about that play, and they make the protagonist more of a hero, where what's so cool about Hamlet is that he's the protagonist, but I'm not sure if he's particularly heroic. He's a tragic character, and yeah, The Lion King changes that enough, or too much I'd say, to kind of ruin it just a little bit. And then in 3rd place, I'll say Shakespeare in Love, which has elements from, like Romeo and Juliet, a little cross-dressing with the Twelfth Night stuff, and elements just from a bunch of his other plays. So this is kind of the most loosely applicable movie to put in any of these categories, but I think it's a really charming movie. Not sure if it should have won Best Picture or not, but I guess I'm glad I did if it got more people paying attention and interested in Shakespeare. But yeah, I'll give it 3rd place. Cute movie, cute historical film about just Shakespeare's life, and kind of historical fiction about his romantic life, and how the writing of these plays kind of might have come about. Really, really fun stuff. Great cast too. Then in 2nd place, I have to go with 10 Things I Hate About You. I think it's basically the 1990s version of a centuries-old, pretty sexist comedy with a feminist spin. And I think it's so much fun. The cast is great. It has those classic rom-com moments. Heath Ledger singing on the bleachers, and it's wonderful. and I love a good rom-com. I love Shakespeare, so this movie has so many things that I enjoy. 10 Things I Hate About You easily gets the second place in this category. And then in first place, it's sort of a tie. It's West Side Story, and it's a tie between the 1961 version and the 2021 version. I was actually pretty surprised at how Spielberg was able to remake the movie, and I think in a lot of ways even actually kind of improve some things. And I didn't expect to like it as much as I already loved the original version, and I might have even liked the newer one even more. I mean, it's probably, rightfully so, one of the most famous retellings of Romeo and Juliet, and it gets so much right, and it addresses really important issues of race and cultural identity and youth and growing up and pride and sort of violence and immaturity and pride and class and things like that. Great musical, great movie musicals, both of them, even though they're, 60 years apart. But yeah, so West Side Story definitely, both versions get a tie for first place here in the film retellings category. Okay, then the third ranking I'm going to do are the movies that are just more strictly adaptations of the plays themselves. And this is a list of nine films, or 9 productions, I should say, because some of them just appeared on like TV. As like part of a series. So they didn't debut in a theater or anything like that. But yeah, kind of to kick things off, just so you can see what I mean by that. In 9th place, I have The Hollow Crown Episode 2. So The Hollow Crown was a series that BBC did, where they basically do most of Shakespeare's history plays. And every episode is, for the most part, a different Shakespeare play. And so they're basically like the series of TV movies, TV movie adaptations of the histories. And sorry, I said the second episode. This is actually the third episode, was Henry IV Part 2. And this has like Jeremy Irons playing Henry IV, and Tom Hiddleston playing Prince Hal, and Simon Russell Beale playing Falstaff. And this is, I think, it kind of plummets a little bit in how much it has me engaged compared to the histories that come before it and even after it. This is kind of the dip in my interest in the Henriette, really. So yeah, I'm gonna have to put this adaptation, The Hollow Crown, with Tom Hiddleston, Jeremy Irons, of Henry IV Part 2, I'm gonna have to put that in 9th place. It just does not hold my attention. And you'll find in this ranking and in where I rank the plays I've read, histories I either really, really love, or I just really don't find much there for me. So there's not much middle ground when it comes to Shakespeare's histories. Then in 8th place, I'm gonna say Romeo plus Juliet. And this is the Baz Luhrmann film from 1996 that updated everything to what it was at Venice Beach with Leonardo DiCaprio and Claire Danes, and everyone has their guns and they call their guns their swords, and it uses most of Shakespeare's original language and stuff in the play, but the modern aesthetic and style and this, the jukebox soundtrack, it's okay. It's weird, and it can be a little off-putting if you're going in wanting to watch a Shakespeare adaptation. If you go in and you're like, I want to watch something a little wacky, a little Baz Luhrmann, chaos infused, then I think you'll have a better time. But if you go in wanting to watch Romeo and Juliet, might not check off all of your boxes. Yeah. So then in 7th place, we're going to go back to that Hollow Crown series of the history adaptations, and I'll actually put the Henry V one here. Again, this is Tom Hiddleston playing Prince Hal, who's now become Henry V, and I think he does a really good job in that role. But again, even for one of the most action-heavy plays, and one of the adaptation has a decent amount of violence and intense moments, it just didn't hold my interest as well as some of the other history adaptations. I honestly, it's a little hard to put my finger on what I didn't enjoy so much about this. Also, by this point, I felt like I had a pretty good sense of who Hal was, our main character was, and I wasn't getting a lot of development for him here, whereas I enjoyed the development we got of him in one of the earlier plays. But by this point, he's become the king, and that's that. And I also missed a lot of the dynamics that he had with other characters in previous history plays. So yeah, I'll put that there. And then in sixth place, I'm gonna go with the Hamlet, the Laurence Olivier Hamlet from 1940, won Best Picture, I believe, and in 1945, I don't know, it was 1940, somewhere in there. Really, really great movie. A little long. I mean, Hamlet's long. This is black and white, and so someone who doesn't necessarily enjoy Hamlet or doesn't necessarily enjoy Shakespeare or black and white films or finds those things a little boring, I could see where this might drag for you. At this point, I had read and seen one live production of Hamlet, and so I was pretty familiar with the story, and I thought the adaptation was really, really good. I thought they did a lot of cool work with the camera, and Olivier did great. I mean, yeah, you might notice if you go back and watch it, sometimes in a few of those older movies, people might be overacting a little bit just because they're used to acting, or Shakespearean acting on the stage, where they have to be extra expressive, where if the camera's right in their face, they don't have to really be as intense as they are being. So there is a little bit of that here, but a really great adaptation of Hamlet. It still ranks, comes in here in sixth place. Then in fifth place, right in the middle of this, and I think this is a pretty good spot for it, is the Romeo and Juliet from 1968, the one with Olivia Hussey. I think it's a cute movie. I think it's definitely much more the setting you picture when you think about Romeo and Juliet. When I think about Romeo and Juliet on film, these two actors portraying both of the title characters, they are the faces that come to mind. Yeah, I think it's a really solid version of the play in film. Then in fourth place, I'm gonna go with a movie. It's kind of just it's a very minimalist kind of production design wise film, but it's Macbeth from 1979. This is Ian McKellen and Judi Dench, and I mean, obviously those two actors are incredible, and they both deliver such amazing performances. I also really just enjoy the story of Macbeth, and also Ian McDermott, Palpatine from Star Wars. He has a few kind of smaller roles to play in this. Really, really great version of the show. Really, because of all the minimalist kind of production design stuff, the focus is really on Shakespeare's language and how these performers are interpreting that and delivering it. So it's really kind of like the actor's movie version of Macbeth, not made up with a lot of effects and gore and bloodshed. It's just about this cast, and they do amazing. Fourth place, Macbeth, 1979. Then in third place, I'll go with the Marlon Brando, Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar is easily one of my favorite of all of Shakespeare's plays, and I think this movie is fantastic. There are other adaptations that I don't like as much, but I haven't seen them as much as I have this one. I think this is really great. Again, if you're someone that like black and white movies might bore you a little more, or for whatever reason might make you a little sleepier, then this is black and white, so you should know that going in. And I think it's told very, very well. The production design is great, and Julius Caesar, easy pick for third place. Then in second place, I'm gonna say, is another Hollow Crown episode. Notice how I put two of them at the bottom, and now I'm putting this one in second place. Is gonna be Henry IV Part 1, and again, this is Simon Russell Beale, Jeremy Irons, Tom Hiddleston, an outstanding cast of well-trained actors. who really deliver their parts super well. I find all of the war politics in this story really compelling. I find all of the comedy bits with Falstaff and Hal in the bar really, really interesting, and I think this adaptation really shows off the kind of difference, the juxtaposition of the how serious Henry IV wants his son to be, and how goofy and ridiculous Hal and Falstaff actually are in the bars. Yeah, I think this is really, really great. A lot of great messages about father-son relationship. Yeah, easy second place. Then in first place, it's another Hollow Crown adaptation, and this is their version of Richard II with Ben Whishaw, who voices Paddington, and he's in he's Q, I think, in some of the newer James Bond movies. He knocks it out of the park. This, I had not heard much about this, and then I found out Hollow Crown existed, and I was like, okay, well, I've always wanted to get into the history, so I'll read a couple, then watch some of the corresponding Hollow Crown episodes. Because Richard II starts off the Henry ad, that's kind of where I started, and both reading it and watching this adaptation, it floored me how poetic the language was, and how specifically Ben Whishaw, his delivery of some of the monologues that Richard II has to give in here, all about power and assuming power and like a lack of self-confidence in your own strength, and wanting to do what's best for the kingdom, all of these things, and where does someone's loyalties lie? Richard II, and particularly this adaptation, really does a lot to help me move Richard II up in pretty much any list I'm gonna rank it in. So yeah, there's that. Again, just a real quick rundown. That's in 9th place, Henry IV Part 2, the Hollow Crown adaptation. In 8th place, Romeo plus Juliet, the Baz Luhrmann 90s adaptation. Then in 7th place is Henry V, Hollow Crown adaptation. And then 6th place, Hamlet, Laurence Olivier. 5th place, Romeo and Juliet, Olivia Hussey. 4th place, Macbeth, Ian McKellen. 3rd place, Julius Caesar, with Brando. 2nd place, Henry IV Part 1, The Hollow Crown. And then 1st place, Richard II, as part of the Hollow Crown series. Alright, part 4 of this Shakespeare ranking video. This is the final section. Here I'm going to rank all 14 of the plays that I've read of his. So that's only, if that's half, it's around half. It might not even be half of everything he's written. But real quickly, before I get into that, I'll go through which ones I have read, just so you can kind of know what to expect or know what not to expect. So if you're waiting for your favorite to show up at number 1, you don't necessarily have to if you know it's something I haven't read. So I'll start in no particular order. The comedies I've read are Comedy of Errors, Taming of the Shrew. I'll say Winter's Tale is a comedy just because of the second half. And then I've read Much Ado About Nothing, and yeah, so those 4 comedies. Then I've read, the tragedies I've read are Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, Hamlet, Julius Caesar, and King Lear. And then those 5 tragedies, and then I've read 5 histories, being Henry IV Part 1, Henry IV Part 2, Richard II, Richard III, and Henry VI Part 1. So, in 14th place of all of those I just named, I think Taming of the Shrew is the one I was least excited by, at least into when I read it. I think it's just a very simple story. I talked a little about what I do like and what I don't necessarily like as much with Taming of the Shrew in as far as the adaptations go. And I think just reading it on the page, some of the comedy just doesn't come across quite as well, and more of the just real sort of like sexist kind of stuff shines through there. Then in 13th place, I'm going to put Henry IV Part 2. As I mentioned when I was talking about the movie adaptations, if I don't really love a history, I'm going to tend to rank it a little bit lower. And Henry IV Part 2, I think, is in the first Henriad. I have read a lot of Henry V, but I don't think I finished it, and I was pretty sleepy when I was reading through it, and so I didn't want to include it here because I didn't read it in the right frame of mind to appreciate it, I think, as much as a lot of people really do appreciate Henry V. But of what I read of that Henriad, Henry IV Part 2 is my least favorite. I think it's slower, it has some of the more like least interesting Falstaff and Hal interactions, and Henry IV himself is just, I don't know, he's sick and he's dying, so it's not my cup of tea, not my favorite play. Then in 12th place, I'll put A Comedy of Errors. I think this one's it's very straightforward. I mean, as far as twins and mixed up identities and confusion and chaos can be, it is still actually pretty straightforward. It's clear what's a comedic beat. It's clear when the plot's moving forward, even though the characters are confused by all the chaos, the reader, it's never too confusing going through, and it's just a fun time. It doesn't have anything I particularly dislike, unlike the two below it. And then in 11th place, I'll put Winter's Tale. I think the only thing that I don't like so much about this is how tonally different it is between, what is it, between Act 3 and 4. It becomes a totally different play. And the questions and a lot of the kind of tragic stuff brought up in the first half, it's stuff I was really interested in being explored in the second half, and it just wasn't. That being said, I like that those questions are raised, and I enjoy both halves kind of on their own, but putting them together as a play is, I don't know. It's weird to have that all in one story. Yeah. So I think I think I do owe this one a reread, a retry at least. Now that I read this pretty early as far as Shakespeare that I was reading. So now that I've read a little more of his stuff, maybe I should go back and reread Winter's Tale. Right now, it's in 11th place, though. And here, I think, is a big jump up in quality where, all the others, I haven't read a lot of the ones that I typically see ranked pretty low, but all the top 10 here are all ones I see pretty regularly, really high up on different people's lists, and for good reason. And I mean, they've been recommended to me, I think, for good reason. But in 10th place, I'm gonna put Richard the Third. This was the most this one kind of felt like the most drawn out of the histories. I think this was actually also the first history I read, and again, similar to Winter's Tale, I should probably return here and give it another read. I also read this right after reading a comedy that I really loved, and so just by contrast, this one gets knocked down just a little bit. Some great moments. Richard III is a compelling character, I think, but yeah. Again, even though this is 10th place out of 14, it seems like it's low, but all of these, I mean, it's Shakespeare, right? So all of these top 10 are going to be amazing. In 9th place, I'm going to put Henry VI Part 1, and this play is wild. I need to continue on with the Henry VI kind of trilogy, because it's kind of weird now. I've read of that, I guess, the first set of 4 Henry history plays that he wrote. I've read Henry VI Part 1 and Richard III, so the bookends of it, but I haven't read Henry VI Part 2 or Henry VI Part 3. I am excited to keep going and read those other two. But yeah, I like this because I think it has more compelling characters, a higher number of interesting things going on than Richard III did, because you have everything with Joan of Arc, and then I really enjoy this stuff with Parliament or parliamentary politics and people trying to scheme, and it's sort of Game of Thrones-esque, everything back in England, and then, like taking what's happening in the war and twisting it to their own purposes. I found that pretty compelling. It is, because there's so much going on, I feel like you don't get like a ton of scenes with any one set of characters, so it kind of moves at such a brisk pace, which is on one hand a good thing. On the other hand, it's like you don't really get to sit in anyone's psyche for a super long time. But yeah, pretty good stuff in Henry VI Part 1. Then in 8th place, I'm gonna say Romeo and Juliet. I read this kind of because I was jealous that I was missing out on this play. In my high school, it was weird. Like, some of us who took like the honors or like AP classes, we were being made to read different Shakespeare than the students in the other English classes, which I always thought was strange, because I mean it's all Shakespeare, and you can learn lessons and you can analyze at different levels if the teachers wanted us to. So I thought it was weird that we read different stuff, but this was something that wasn't on our syllabus to read in my high school English classes, but so many of my friends were reading it, and so I was like, oh well, I gotta read Romeo and Juliet. So then I read Romeo and Juliet. Then when I was a substitute teacher, a teacher was out for like a whole week, like the drama teacher was, and we watched a couple of Romeo and Juliet adaptations, and in that time I would talk some of the students in that class through some of the scenes that they were having a little more trouble understanding. So that, I think, made me appreciate some of the language here a little more, even though the story is pretty simple, pretty straightforward, and obviously by the end melodramatic. And I mean, if you just look at it on a logic level, it's a little like, oh really, you both love each other so much, and now that means dying for each other. It's pretty sudden, love at first sight, and it's not always my favorite trope, but I do think Shakespeare gets away with a lot of it because of how beautiful the language is. And then going across the sort of halfway point here, I'm going to say in 7th place is Much Ado About Nothing. I mentioned before the comedy that I read right before I read Richard III, and this is what that comedy was, and I thought it was hilarious. I loved all of the kind of innuendos and stuff, and I could just so clearly hear and see people performing this kind of in my head when I was reading through it. Unlike some of the other ones, like Henry VI Part 1, I felt like I was reading more of a book, but with Much Ado About Nothing, I felt like I could actually see it on the stage while I was reading it. And again, yeah, it made me laugh. I think it's definitely my favorite comedy of Shakespeare's that I've read. In 6th place, this is something I read as a senior in high school, and this was Macbeth. I like Macbeth. It's a little short and a little similar to how one of my problems with Romeo and Juliet might be that they're pretty quick to fall in love. In Macbeth, I think they're all pretty quick to violence, at least the titular character is. And that's really my only problem with it that knocks it down out of the top 5. I can't say too much about Macbeth other than it's great. Lady Macbeth is one of the best. I don't know if we call her an antagonist or a co-protagonist, a sort of villainous co-conspirator, accomplice, but she's fascinating, and every one of her scenes is fantastic. And this is honestly helped by the fact that I saw a movie where Judi Dench played her, and she did an amazing job. And then in 5th place is Hamlet, and I know this is a lot of people's favorite, and for good reason. Does a lot to delve into the mind of the main character, and he's definitely not your typical protagonist. He's not a hero in any sense of the word. He's kind of fighting for his deceased father's honor in his memory, but he's more just kind of losing his mind than he is actually doing anything heroic. And then in the end, it just leads to not a glorious fight, but just a bloody, upsetting one. And so I I think it's a really, really fascinating story, and I think there's more to analyze and pick apart with the characters in something like Hamlet than there is with something like Macbeth. So yeah, I'll put Hamlet in 5th place. And then in 4th, I'm going to say Henry IV Part 1. I think this is easily one of my 2 favorite of the histories I've read. And I love all of the scenes and the interactions between Falstaff and Hal. I think this is when Shakespeare's writing both of these characters at their like wittiest, their sharpest. I also think this is some of the best political intrigue and kind of like war storytelling going on. You know, comparing what's his name, Percy, and all of them are doing, comparing or going to a scene of them and then going back to a scene of Henry IV and his people, but then you know he wants to rope in Hal, but it's so interesting seeing how or seeing him trying to convince his son to assume more responsibility and to grow into leadership a little better. Eventually, we know we've got the privilege of the other plays and you know just history or historical knowledge to know that he will, but they don't know it at the time, and so I found this play really, really compelling. So that comes in at Henry IV Part 1 comes in 4th place. Then in 3rd, this is one of the most recent ones I've read. Henry VI Part 1 is actually the most recent, but this is 2nd most recent, and that's King Lear. This is the only one I have an individual copy of, like outside of a bigger collection. But yeah, King Lear, an easy 3rd place. I'll say it's an easy 3rd. However, what would make it more difficult is that might be too low for how much I love this. I thought everything with madness and going crazy, as interesting as it was to see what Shakespeare did with that concept in Hamlet, I think he just went full tilt into those kinds of ideas in King Lear. And the Edgar-Edmund conflict is fantastic. All of the sisters that are, you know, inheriting and the paranoid Lear thinks threatening his rule, and in some cases are actually kind of threatening his strength, you know, and his ability to govern his lands in his final days, final years. All of that, all of those, the daughters there are, they all have such unique characters and their marriages, who they're betrothed to. It all stands out. I found it one of the easier Shakespeare plays to follow along with on like a first read through without having to go like, you know, backtrack and, you know, make sure that I was understanding what was going on. Everything with the fool or the jester, I forget exactly what they call him, but all of Lear's conversations with him are kind of hilarious, but also kind of tragic. So yeah, Lear, an easily at least 3rd place. I'll put it in 3rd place right now just so I'm not using too much recency bias to, you know, put it up any higher. And then in 2nd place, I'm going to say Richard II is still my favorite history I've read. And it was only the 2nd history I ever read of his after Richard III. I thought this was... whereas Lear had a lot of different characters that Shakespeare kind of really got into the mind of, this one only is kind of similar, I think in a lot of ways to Hamlet, only at least structurally has one character that he's really focusing on, and that's of course Richard II. And I just love all of the things that he's thinking through, what it means to rule when your kingdom perceives you as weak. What if you actually are weak? What's the burden of rulership, of being the king, and then how much power does your kingdom have to, you know, get you out of power? Slight diversion here, but I wrote a paper in in undergrad all about Charles I of England, and a lot of Charles I's story and a lot of things that he kind of wrote about himself and his mindset at the end of his life before Parliament had him executed. A lot of that I found myself thinking back on while I was reading Richard II, which, I mean, you know, he's a king that predates Charles II or Charles I by a few centuries. But I think it's just so interesting, these sort of like patterns of history, and Richard II, again, just as a character and a historical figure, how Shakespeare chooses to explore that in this play. It's brilliant, and also the language is really poetic and really flows nicely. So Richard II comes in second place. And then, last but definitely not least, one of the first Shakespeare I ever read was Julius Caesar. And I read this in high school for the first time. I've read it a couple times since, and I think it's fantastic. The thing that took me most by surprise and what made me really fall in love with it in the first place was that Brutus is really the protagonist here, and this is one of the first times I had been assigned to read something where the protagonist and hero didn't exactly line up, because I think a case could be made for either Caesar being a heroic kind of figure, a case could also be made for Mark Antony being a more heroic figure, but we definitely spend most of our time watching or reading about Brutus and him contemplating what right a war hero has to control the masses and to be so lionized and so popular with the common people as Julius Caesar was, and then what right does that person have to start controlling things in government, and then is a violent way to put a stop to all of this, to pump the brakes on Caesar? Is violence really the best way to go about that? And then, of course, there's everything with the aftermath. Now that Caesar's dead, the common people hate the Senate, and who's going to play this better, Mark Antony or Brutus? Who's going to win over the masses in the absence of Caesar? That whole contest is so interesting. And I should also say I really I didn't mention it in my adaptation rankings, but the show Rome, or the HBO produced series Rome, it only got up to 2 seasons, but I think they definitely took a lot from the works of Shakespeare here in Julius Caesar, and then in Antony and Cleopatra, to kind of inspire some of the structure of that show, and some of the portrayals of the main players at this big moment in history, the actors that play them. Tobias Menzies plays Brutus in that, and whenever I think about this play, even though I haven't seen Menzies play Brutus in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, I will always picture him as Brutus. So yeah, Julius Caesar, easy number 1, and that does it for my Shakespeare kind of series of a few different rankings, divided by the different ways that I've watched or read Shakespeare's works. If you enjoyed the video, or if you'd like to see any more Shakespeare content, or if you'd like me to look into other playwrights, or maybe other historical fiction, stuff like that, please subscribe, please leave a comment below, especially if you really strongly disagree with how I rank things, or if there's a play that when you were listening to me talking about it, you kind of thought to yourself, oh, he hasn't read that in a while. If he went back to it, I'm sure he'd love it now. Something like that. Again, as always, feel free to comment, and thank you so much for watching the video. Have a nice day.